Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
When it comes to towing, seeing is believing. That's why Chevy Truck's advanced camera technology offers up to 8 available cameras for 14 unique views, so you can focus on the view that really matters. Chevrolet, together let's drive. Learn more about Chevy Trucks at Chevy.com. Safety or driver assistance features are no substitute for the driver's responsibility to operate the vehicle in a safe manner. Read the Vehicle Owner's Manual for important feature limitations and information.
The Athletic.
On this week's show, we look into F1's latest Flexi-wing controversy, dig into the details of why Red Bull's performance continues to decline, and answer your questions on Red Bull spec reversion, adjustable aero, and Mercedes anti-dive experiments. Welcome to another edition of the Race F1 Tech Show. I'm Edd Straw, but as always, I've got the man, the myth, the legend, Gary Anderson with me, ready to unleash his technical insights. So, Gary, just come off the back of Monza, a circuit you've run cars at many times. It's still a wonderful outlier in F1, isn't it?
It is a wonderful outlier. I mean, it's the other end of the scale from Monaco, which is great. And to be honest, to see Ferrari win both Monaco, and Charles Leclerc winning both Monaco and Monza in the one season, I think, for the Ferrari supporters, you couldn't ask for much better than that. It was really, really good to see it. I mean, the crowds were fantastic. It's just, it was a great end result, to be honest. I know we'd all have loved to seen, or a lot of us would have loved to seen McLaren carry up their 1-2 that they had on the grid and to a 1-2 in the race. But to be honest, I think it is Ferrari's home circuit, so let's give them that one. And they deserved it. They did something that the others didn't do in their strategy. So it's great to see them outwit somebody for a change, because normally they're the ones that get outwitted. And it's great for Formula One that Ferrari won Monaco and Monza.
Yeah, it was a fantastic day, always is, when Ferrari win there. And it just shows where Formula One's at the moment, that it was quite close. You can win a race having a car that's thereabouts and executing well, nice and condensed at the front, which is what we want to see. So, as usual, we'll start off with a bit of a free choice. What topic would you like to get your teeth into first, Gary? Well,
the thing that's gathering a lot of column inches at the moment is this front wing deflection, or front wing bending, whatever you like to call it. I think that's something that's worthy of a little bit of a discussion, because, it's been around for a long time. It's nothing new, to be honest. And I even wrote some articles, I think, in 2022, 2023 about, I thought Mercedes, watching it with just a simple little FOM camera and my eye, you could see that Mercedes was backing off much more than anybody else. They're not quite as bad now, but that's a different story. I did say in my articles during those 2 years that, with Mercedes having their problems, it might be the correct thing to do is to make their front wing as rigid as possible, as fixed as possible, and then identify your problem. And how you would do that would be to simply run the car with a certain wing angle on it, get the car to a level where basically your balance is quite good in the high-speed corners, and you'll probably have understeer in the low-speed corners. But get the car comfortable in medium to high speed corners at least, and then put more front wing on the car and try to get it so the understeer is reduced in the lower speed corners, and then you'll be able to say, well, we need a center pressure shift from X speed to X speed of 1%, 1.5%, 2%. So as the car goes faster, the center pressure goes rearward, and the only way you could do that is to flex the front wing. Rotationally flex the front wing, so it basically backs off with the extra load in it. But there is the FIA test to comply with, and as far as I'm concerned, reading through the regulations, as far as they're concerned, they're a bit stupid, really. They apply the load at between from the central line of the front wheel forward. They apply the load of 100 kilograms at either X going forward 800 millimeters or up to 1,000 millimeters, somewhere those two positions they can apply the load. But that's right at the front of the wing on the outboard end. So basically they're measuring deflection, they're measuring wing deflection as far as bending is concerned, but they're not in any way measuring rotation. So if they were just to simply keep the X minus 100, which is a metre forward of the centre line of the front wheel, and change the 800 to 500, so it's X minus 500, they would, and can load up either of them with 100 kilograms, then they would measure deflection and rotation. So it's one of those sort of situations. I think the test is inadequate for what the teams are doing with it. But is it a new thing? No, it's not really. This year, at the beginning of the season, again, I wrote an article about Red Bull moving their adjuster to the inboard end of the wing. In other words, they were supporting the wing where it joins to the little bit of wing that's on the side of the nose. So they weren't, they didn't want that section to deflect. And it was a bit of a strange thing, but I thought that, they could create more outwash by letting the outboard end of the wing flex, even though the outboard end of the wing has got a lot less load in it. So I think it's shown to me that what we're seeing at Red Bull at the moment isn't always the best solution. I felt at that point in time, as I say, it was to get more outwash. But obviously then the centre of pressure shift isn't as big because the part of the wing that's really working, the sort of middle or the inboard 2/3, it wasn't deflecting. So they weren't getting the centre of pressure shift rearward. And now they've changed, and now the adjuster itself is on the outboard end, so they let the inboard end deflect. So everybody's up to it. It's just about how much you need, how much consistency you can get from it, because anything that gets tricky, it's really tricky to get the same deflection over two components. But as I say, to me, it all starts with the FIA test being inadequate for what the teams are doing with it. The teams have found the grey area. The wing's strong enough in bending, so it passes the FIA test, but it's weak in rotation. So, it's going to keep going because teams are now blaming other teams, and they're all looking at McLaren as far as the fact that they're doing it. It happens to everybody because it's impossible to have a completely rigid structure. The way the system is, so you've got to allow a bit of leeway here and there. That's what the test should incorporate. But looking at the videos of the McLaren, I wouldn't get excited that it was doing it more than anybody else. They might just be making better use of it because that's what the team has done. It's come from struggling a bit midfield to being probably the most competitive car right now. And they didn't do that by accident. They did that because they thought about a few things. And they've got themselves to a point where, like last year, they'd be saying the car was not good in slow corners, it's very good in high-speed corners. And that amount of front-wing deflection, or rotational loss, I suppose you might call it, with load, is something that can change the car dramatically in that area. So you can get enough front load on it in low speed and not too much front load on it at high speed. So it'll carry on a bit. I'm sure the regulations will change for next year. I think somebody should clarify it a little bit for this year. It's only one number in the regulations, and I think if they rewrote that, we'd see a bit of skullduggery going down the pit lane because it would change things a bit. But why do you change the regulations? You change them because there's a mistake in them or there's something being exploited. But the problem is you don't want to change it because one team has used the current regulation to get the best out of it. So it'll be interesting to see what the FIA do.
It's a perennially difficult thing because there's two sets of regs, aren't there? There's the load tests, which are your practical tests to see if you're legal, but there's also the general all-purpose things have got to be rigid, secure and mobile, I think is the phraseology, which, as you explained, isn't actually possible. So that's why there's a necessary grey area in this whole thing. Do you think that this has become even more an important area under the current regs? Obviously, in the past, there's always been a benefit if you can back it off on the straights and then have the wing come back for the corners, great. But now we've got this problem with the cars of the struggling for the front end in the slower stuff because of the way the regs are. So you want as much front end load as you can for slower corners, but you run the risk of, because the speed is much higher, and obviously the front wings themselves running ground effect as well. So you have this problem of if you've got the front end, you then end up with the sort of front wing downforce so much in the fast corners that you lose the balance and you end up with a really oversteery car. So it's moved the frame of reference in terms of what you need it to do, because you don't just want it not backed off at all in the corners and backed off on the straights. You want to tune it so that the front wing is there for the level you want at the corners without it being there too much, because you actually want to knock back some of that downforce for the high speed stuff to avoid that oversteer.
Well, yeah, that's really the plan. I mean, we talk about the wings working on ground effect. Obviously, the wing deflection test, I think it's 15 millimetres you're allowed with 100 kilograms placed on the outboard end. Now, 50 millimetres is a lot, but that outboard end isn't actually producing a lot of vertical load, let's say, because of the way the flaps are. So the deflection, the bending in the main plane, I suppose you might call it, is not as dramatic as it was in years gone past, whenever you had a lot of wing angle out there. So now it's not so much a case of that. You're reducing the front downforce by rotation, and your gain with ground effect on the front wing is also minimal because of the height of the front wing at the higher working parts. So I wouldn't say that the gain from ground effect on the front wing was something you needed to get excited about, although it would increase the front wing load characteristics. So that rotation can compensate a little bit for that. But the rotation that you're trying to build into it is much more than that. It's a bigger shift than just the gain from ground effect, the small gain from ground effect. So it is very, very complicated to get it right. And I would imagine that, through time, there has been a few different stiffness setups on front wing that you might find in the back of somebody's truck here and there. So, because that's how you evolve it. If you know the rotation you want, and that's why I said about the Mercedes thing to begin with, find out the centre of pressure shift you need, and then you know the wing angle shift you need from low speed to high speed to get the car balanced in both areas. Then you know the rotational shift you need, and then you can work out the stiffness, so you can build yourself a torsional rig for the front wing, and just measure that basically, because you put the load on the front of the wing. So as such, you put the load on the front of the wing that the wing is creating, and you put the load on the rear of the wing, so you can torsionally get rid of those 2 or 3 degrees, or whatever it is, a front wing angle that you've got. So you can do it in the factory. You can build yourself a test rig that would tell you whether or not for these loads I've got X shift of centre of pressure in the wind tunnel, and these loads give that same angle shift on a rig. So you can do most of it in the factory. You don't have to come to the racetrack. But I wouldn't be surprised at the racetrack if there's a slight coding on a couple of spare noses that says, this is a slightly more deflection on this front wing, or rotation on this front wing, than on this other one. So you might test both of them at a track and just see where the stiffness is. So it's just something the FIA have to clamp down on if they want to clamp down on it. If you want to make it free, then just do one load test at one position. If everybody passes it, done, end of story. So it's difficult to comply with the regulations it is, but it's also around that regulation, make it work for you. That's the best way of putting it, because that's what the teams are all trying to do. Get the best, comply with the regulation, but make it work for you also if you're allowed to deflect someone. But as you say, there is one rule that says nothing can move. And if you were to implement that, then there's no car in the pit lane legal, because everything deflects to a certain extent. So you've got to allow some leniency there to allow it. Maybe you have to give a percentage allowance or something of that nature. But there is no, and the FIA found this, to be honest, one of the biggest things to do is to prove it. And unless you're going to take video evidence and just look at video evidence and say that's moving, and then that's a judgment, isn't it? That's a judgment for everybody to say, well, Joe Bloggs is moving even more on video evidence. So anyway, I'm sure it'll rattle on for a while.
Yeah, obviously it's Ferrari and Red Bull who are concerned, and as you alluded to, it is a question of, if you can't join them, then try and beat them legally, isn't it? That's kind of the way they'll be thinking. And it's a bit of a surprise, really, because Red Bull have been pretty good at aero elasticity in aero parts. They've done some very clever things over the years, and I do mean very clever things. I'm not saying that it's in any way cheating, because it is part of the game, as we've been saying. So it's a bit of a surprise that Red Bull find themselves in this position, and I do wonder whether the years of this building up means that they might feel that there's different understandings for different teams of what you can do, because of course, as well as the regs, there's also all the TDs and the conversations. There've been clampdowns that have been a bit targeted at Red Bull over the years, even going back to the early 2010s. It was a huge thing, wasn't it? All those front wings. So I guess that's the question, isn't it? Is in Red Bull's case, for example, and not the only one, Ferrari also concerned, is it they can't do it, or that do you think there might be genuinely some uncertainty to think, well, hang on a minute, you pushed back on us doing this back then, and then another technical regime is there and saying different things. So that's why it becomes so difficult when there's so much regulation that's done in back channels, isn't it? Because there's TDs that everyone has, but there's also just the general conversations going back years.
Yeah, there is. I mean, it's one of those things, the TDs should clarify this sort of stuff, but the TDs come out and there is no definitive number change on them, I suppose you might call it. As I say, that for me, the simple thing, if I was there, I would say that from X race, we're going to change this position of this deflection test so we can measure rotation. And that, as I say, would fire alarm bells right up and down the pit lane. It would mean that basically teams would have to do something new. Mid-season, that's not a great thing. You have to pay for it. But at the end of the day, Formula One is talking about being worth more than it's ever thought about being worth. And each team's worth more than it's ever thought about being worth. So sometimes you have to spend money. If you've got to chase grey areas, you got to be happy enough to be caught. Now, this is definitely a grey area because the load tests, everybody complies with them. So there's definitely nothing wrong there. But they found a way to let rotation do the work. As I say, you don't want the bending because the wing height changing at the outboard end can create more ground effect. So you don't want that really happening. So the load test as it is for bending, really. So, you're the main plane bending. So you're trying to police a deflection that actually isn't beneficial to the car. The deflection that's beneficial to the car is at rotating. And it's been going on for years, as you say. There's just, massive amount of it. It's just been something that's very, very difficult because nothing on the car is rigid. It all moves a little bit here and there. But I think the load tests, if you're going to have them, they need to chase the way the teams are adapting to stuff, So from my point of view, that's what I would be looking at, as I say. But again, you never know with the teams. Sometimes the teams want to get clarification here and there. One of the things I've always said about the front wing and the flap trailing edge is that I think you want something fairly uniform, so you're not getting transverse flow across the front wing. When you look at it, I think McLaren had a front wing trailing edge flap with a big scallop out the middle of it somewhere. I didn't think that was a great idea, and I'm really pleased that they didn't end up using it. It's just one of those sort of things. I think the Ferrari front wing detail was fairly uniform, because the problem is if you've got one part of the wing working harder than the other part of the wing, or you're giving up a lot of the wing because you're putting a big scallop in it, then as I say, you get this transverse flow which affects things further downstream. So again, it's such a complex sort of little scenario to sort of get on top of. But we have lots of people. Perhaps the wind tunnel time allocation for success is doing a decent job. Perhaps it is limiting Red Bull a little bit, and their understanding and ability to optimize that type of thing. But as I say earlier, for me, to get a front wing that deflects by rotation to your advantage, it would be more of static rig tests in the factory than lots of aerodynamic testing, because the model's different. The model's a different size from the real car. It'd be very, very difficult to have the same sort of simulation for it. So you can't basically make sure that the thing has got the same stiffness. So the simulation of the front wing deflection would be nigh on impossible. All you need to know is that at this angle it gives me X center of pressure, And at this angle here, which would be at high speed, that's giving me X center pressure. And that's enough of a shift to make the car balance in both those corners.
And it should be noted that in terms of the Flexi-wings, the FIA is happy that cars have been legal so far. They've done all their load tests, etc., etc. So it does seem that if there are going to be changes, it's going to be for next year. And that's what they've been working on with the extra cameras they've been running on cars since Spa, etc. But I imagine they'll be continuing to lobby a little bit Ferrari and Red Bull, and potentially among others, for the rest of the season.
Yeah, I mean, they're obviously trying to ignite a spark on a fire somewhere to see if it'll burn. It's one of those sort of situations where clarifying is the most important thing, and making sure you clarify it before next year. Next year's regulations are theoretically the same as this year's regulations, so at this point in time, there's no big change. But once again, whenever we see this from the FIA, they say they got to put all these special cameras on the front to measure this deflection, and you can see it on the onboard cameras. I can watch it, seeing and it's deflecting. The wings do deflect on every car. But it's, the degree of deflection and where it is the important thing. So are McLaren pushing it a bit more to the limit? Obviously, as the FIA say, every car's legal. That's all okay. It's great. It's just the test is wrong.
And, of course, connected to that, probably when Ferrari and Red Bull are trying to do the same thing, they can't do it in such a controlled way because, as you said, that's so important. So, yeah, this one I think is going to run and run. Right, let's move on to Red Bull's problems now, because they've been growing, haven't they, Gary? Getting gradually a little bit worse, and Zandvoort and Monza weren't exactly encouraging, were they, with endless experiments. Christian Horner admitted they were concerned and found it confusing. What do you make of the whole thing? They're running mix and match floors, throwing older floors on. The newer floor seems to be quicker. Talking about trying to find a direction. It's extraordinary that this team's in such a mess, really, in terms of its technical direction, considering it seemed so sure-footed just a few months ago.
Yeah, it is, that's for sure. I mean, it's very, very hard to actually pinpoint why. And obviously the first thing to say is that, Adrian Newey has moved on, and his full-time input or his brain power is not associated with the team anymore, really. So it's one of those sort of situations. It's very easy to jump in there and say, it's all because of Adrian going. The big thing for me with these cars is that, every team will tell you in the pit lane, it's really hard to simulate what's going on because the cars work very close to the ground. They work better very close to the ground. Now, when you're doing your wind tunnel testing, that's impossible. You can't put the car that low to the wind tunnel belt. So you've got to really, and I'm sure they do all this stuff, I'm talking here fairly naively from a distance, but you've really got to plot out how the downforce is increasing as the car gets near the ground. And then you've got to extrapolate that a bit into the area where you can't research it to see what might happen, to see what you think's happening. You've got to look really closely at the sort of hysteresis of the underfloor. In other words, when it gets near the ground, some parts of it will start to stall at some ride height. And then you just need to look at when that stall reattaches itself as the car comes back up again. Because the one thing you do, Monza, for example, you arrive at that first corner, 350 kilometres an hour or whatever, and you stand on the brake pedal and you have about 100 metres to slow the car down to about 80 kilometres an hour. So the car moves very quickly. The car changes ride height very quickly during that period. And if you've got a separation problem in the underfloor that doesn't reattach during that braking point, then you'll have to brake a bit earlier. And all that's lap time just gone. Or the rear of the car's inconsistent. So it's so much stuff that you need to interpolate and have gut feel for that is happening in the wind tunnel. And then again, whenever you run in a wind tunnel, part of the cost of the wind tunnel is actually keeping the temperature stable, so you can back-to-back stuff and make sure that the temperature is the same. The first thing you do is go to a racetrack where it might be 10 degrees ambient, or it could be 35 degrees ambient. It's not the same. The car is not the same. So if you've got aerodynamic characteristic changes with small temperature fluctuations in the wind tunnel, you have massive aerodynamic shift with the temperatures that you see at the racetrack. And I think, that's the area where I'd say that Adrian Newey has got a bit of depth in his experience over the years. And I think that's the sort of thing that's hurting Red Bull now. They don't have that. They've got some really clever people there, but they just, I don't think, they're all coming from the days of punching numbers into a big spreadsheet and coming up with the answer at the bottom of it. Whereas Adrian's from the age where he would do that with a pencil and come up with his own assumption, and he would always question it, question the answer. I mean, it's one of the things I always used to do. Some of the guys that I had, super bright people, and they come up, stress a wishbone, and they come up with a set of numbers, say, X, Y, Z load whenever you got 5G braking, and you'd sort of say, well, are you sure? Because that doesn't sound right to me. And that's only because you'd think about it. You wouldn't just rely on that Excel sheet. You'd think about it, and you get a number in your head. And usually, 9 times out of 10, they go away and come back and say, we've got the calculation a little bit wrong. But because you've got this big spreadsheet that's calculating it for you, you believe the answer. If you're actually sort of thinking through it in your head, you question the answer. So I think they've sort of gone around that corner. All their new people are growing up. They're doing a great job. But they will never have that grounding experience that somebody like Adrian had. So as far as sitting in the meeting and trying to see between the lines, I think they're missing that now.
Yeah, and they've talked about the problem, the disconnection in the balance, that if they get the rear where they want it to turn in, they end up with no front end, and they get the understeer problems. So you had the problem with understeer kind of kicking in Q3 in the conditions, struggling on the fresh tyres, feeling the balance was better on the scrub tyres, all of these things that they've been struggling with. And in fact, Christian Horner said they could see some races last year where they were starting to see some of these problems. He cited Austin as one of them, where they were just sort of starting to see the beginnings of these problems, which of course indicates it's a slightly longer term thing. It's not quite as simple as sort of Newey left and they're struggling, but obviously his influence had sort of reduced a little bit over time. He'd done the suspension originally, and the suspension could be part of the problem potentially. It's worked very, very well for them, but as others have pushed on, they found new peaks. So it's really complicated, but it's the fact that they are seemingly considering rolling back on spec quite a long way is a big worry. Do you think that there's potentially, it could be one of those things that they get a front wing on, get a modified floor, it could all come back together, or might they be boxed in with the RB20 and they need to make some shift changes on the RB21? And how awkward a situation does that put them in? Because with 26 on the horizon, ideally they'll have wanted to get 24 done, get on with developing the 25 car, so that as much of their wind tunnel and CFD time from the start of January next year, when they're allowed to do aero testing on 26, is devoted to 26.
Well, I think what we could say is that Red Bull have gone forward between 2023 and 2024. They have theoretically a faster car. Well, theoretically, they actually have a faster car. It's just the others have got a faster car. And that's obviously compounded the problem. The big thing for me is, again, Monza, as you say. Q2, a scrub set of softs at the end of it. I think it was a 19.6 that Verstappen did. And then on new tyres in Q3, first run on new tyres in Q3, he did a 20.03 or something. And they put another set of new tyres on the car for the second run. Why would you do that? Why would you not say, I know that these second-hand tyres we did just at the end of Q2 were faster than new tyres? Why not give it a shot on it? Because Matt's gone out with a set of old tyres. For sure, it's your confidence is better with new tyres, but if the balance isn't there, then the lap time's not there. If he was going out with a set of second-hand tyres in Q3 at the end of it, or a set of used tyres or such, they've only done one lap. It's like, no, they haven't done a lot. Then at the end of the day, he would know that actually I can push a bit harder. So that 19.6 might have turned into a 19.4, just from the driver point of view, because he knows, well, hang on, the balance is going to be a bit better here, so I can just extract a little bit more from it. So I don't understand some of these decisions that they make, for sure. It's a difficult thing to know because everybody complains about the tyres a lot. Now, if I look through the sort of my period of tyre blankets, warm-up stuff and all that, we created blankets back in the early days of Jordan that heated the tyre through the sidewall, and the tyre tread you would put up to 40 degrees. The tyre sidewall you'd have at 120. So you heated the sidewall, which heated the internal part of the tyre, but you didn't cook it through the tyre tread, because we found that it was better. You had a faster tyre at basically the same temperature, but you didn't heat the tyre up through the tyre tread. You heated it up from the inside outwards rather than from the outside inwards. Now, you can't do that. The blankets now have to be all the same temperature, tread and sidewall. But it's the time spent there. I think the slicks now, you can heat them up to 70 degrees, and you've got 3 hours, I think it is, maybe to maximum of 3 hours at rising from from 20 degrees C, let's say, up to 70 degrees C. But it doesn't take that long. So I feel that some of these tyres that go on the car have been heated once, because you're always going to have a set of soft tyres, for example, ready just in case you go out for one of the sessions and you flat spot them. You've got to have another set ready at that temperature, but then you might not use them for half an hour as well. You might need them, so they have to be there, and then you might not need them for half an hour or even later than that. So I would love to go through, as a team, their procedure for tyre warm-up, how they get them to that point right at the moment you put them on the rim, on the car, because I think you can damage a tyre so much by double heating it, or even keeping it at that 70 degrees as a flat line, stable temperature. The warm up to that, you've got to put them in. You've got to let the tyre warm up at the rate it'll warm up, whatever that is. So you put them in at 20 degrees. Your input of heat into the tyre takes X amount of time. Let's just say it's an hour to get up to 70 degrees, and that's the time you want to put them on the car. You don't want to let it sit at 70 degrees for a while. You don't want to be warming it twice. So it's just one of these areas. Now, all that gets taken away by running the tyre the second time. It's the first time that it will either help you or hurt you. If you get it right, the tyre will have a lot of grip. If you get it wrong, the tyre will have less grip. But once you've run the tyre once, and you go for a second run, as Verstappen did in Q2, all that's gone, because the tyre's been heated up to 110, 120 degrees on the circuit. So, it's now a hardened tyre, but that hardened tyre could give you a better balance, because it doesn't have one end grip and not the other end grip that a new tyre has coming in. So I think there's an area there that I would say that if you sat down with a team, you could really tidy it all up a bit. I'm not saying anybody does it wrong, but I'm saying that with the regulations, you've got X amount of tyres, X amount of soft tyres. You've definitely got to have a set ready to go at any point in time. And if that happens to be the last set you're going to use in Q3, or the last two sets you're going to use in Q3, then you're in trouble. Because you're going to have one of those sets ready for Q2, for sure, because you might need it. So it's a sort of juggling act, really. It's an act of confidence to either know that you're going to do your best you can with just one set of soft tyres in Q1, one set in Q2, and then the two sets in Q3, and you plan the plug-in for the blankets accordingly, and you take that gamble. If you need a second set in Q1 or Q2, you're scuppered.
To reference something you said in part one about the aero testing limitations, how big a part do you think this might be playing in Red Bull's situation? Because I'm not even just thinking in terms of the troubleshooting now, but if you go back through this regulation cycle, they've pretty much always been on the least, plus they had that extra 10% reduction for the cost cap breach. So That's a lot less research they've generally done. And I guess one of the things that I've said in the past, they haven't suffered too much from it because they seem to have chosen the right path.
Yeah.
Others might have been able to look at more paths or whatever, but if you're efficient with it and you get it right, you're okay. But I'm now starting to wonder if, maybe they did end up missing some area of research, or they weren't able to take it far enough. Yeah. And that's why they've kind of hit this limitation with the approach they've got. And maybe the McLaren approach has got a higher ceiling in terms of performance. And yeah, that's the worrying thing. Even before you start thinking about whether they've got the aero testing resource to fix it all.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to hurt for sure. I mean, if you put, let's say, a new underfloor or a new floor in the car in the wind tunnel, and you put it in there, and McLaren have got, let's say, 10 runs they can do to optimize it and research it. Red Bull have got a lot less, so they're going to have to make sort of different decisions. They're going to have to sort of drop out of it some of the tests they would normally have done in the past whenever they had more wind tunnel time. What I'm really saying, I suppose, is that to read between the lines, you've got to do that. McLaren have got less reading between the lines to do. Red Bull have got a lot more reading between the lines to do right now, and I think that's where Adrian was pretty good at, reading between the lines and sort of trying to find out, trying to sort of analyse whether or not there could be a problem coming from this. So yes, for sure the wind tunnel time will be hurting them, because, as I say, rather than going into the wind tunnel and doing a complete research program that you do on a new component, i.e. like an underfloor, you have to limit that. You have to just instead of trying the front turning vanes, let's say it, 5 different curvatures or 5 different angles, you've now got to do it in 3. And just, then it's reading between those 3 and saying, okay, well, maybe we go 1 more degree or a slightly different radius or whatever on here, because that's what it's pointing us to. But it doesn't always work that way. So, for sure, that's what it's there for. It's there to hurt the successful teams and give the less successful teams a little bit more of an advantage. That's what it's all about. And the budget cap, then again, it's the same for every team, or it should be the same for every team. So at the end of the day, the big teams can't just buy their way out of it. They're now stuck with the same sort of budget. So McLaren and Red Bull and Mercedes and Ferrari and all of the rest of them, if they've got the budget, can't just buy more bits for the car. They just can't throw them in the car and then throw them away again. You have to make it all count. So the regulations have done a good job there. If that's what we want, that's what we've got. So let's not just push it that Red Bull are being a bit thick. The regulations have meant that everybody should catch them up. Has that happened? Yes, it has. So let's complement the regulations a little bit if that's what we really want. Nobody can run away with it. Red Bull did for 2 years. They paid the price because they got the success, which meant they got the reduced wind tunnel time. So they're paying the price for that now.
Now, Red Bull do seem to think they've got a good direction now, that the experiments at Zandvoort and Monza have meant they know what they need to do. Now, how convinced would you be by that when you're in that situation, when you think you've got a direction? Can you ever be 100% confident in it?
With these cars, I don't think so. I think that's a fairly bold statement to make, to be honest, and I'm sure it'll come back and bite them at some point in time. I think we could look at Zandvoort and Monza as being outliers where they really didn't get it right. We could look last year at Singapore, I think it was, where they just didn't get it right. It happens now and again. Every bird falls off the tree sometime. So it's just one of those sort of situations where I think that, keep your mouth shut, prove it, just get on with it. There's nothing to say that they shouldn't be on the front row in Azerbaijan and win the race. It could happen. They are still up there. They are still a very competitive team, but it's one of those sort of situations where the last couple of races have bit them a bit harder than than prior to that. And again, they're not. I've no question that Sergio Perez is a good driver, but they're not getting the points that Sergio should bring into the equation. And he's been a little bit better lately, but not as good as they need as a second driver. If you look at McLaren with Piastri and Norris, 2 exceptional drivers driving a good car can bring home good points. Again, Ferrari with Leclerc and Sainz the same. Mercedes with Hamilton and Russell the same. In normal circumstances, they've got two car teams, whereas all the best will in the world on the best day, Red Bull have got a 1-car team, and Sergio will bring home some points, but he doesn't seem to be bringing home those sort of big double points. He's bringing home single points, I suppose you might call it, single number points as such. So all of that's compounding the problem, isn't it? So if they found the problem and they're heading off to try and fix it, let time answer that question.
Yeah, and we certainly will get an answer over time on Red Bull's performance, but it certainly meant the season has become much more interesting, and there's a great storyline now for the next few months and going into next season as well. Let's move on to our usual final part, which is listener questions, and we'll start off with a few that are going to connect very much to the main topic we were talking about earlier with Red Bull. If you've got a question you'd like Gary to answer, it can be on anything F1 as long as it's at least tangentially technical. It could be ancient or modern, something you want explained, anything you like at all. Send it to podcasts@therace.com. That's podcasts@the-race.com. You can write the question in the email, or if you prefer, you can send it as a voice note. If you do that, remember to say your name. The first question, Gary, comes from Chris in the USA. Max Verstappen is clearly frustrated after Monza. I realise there's a cost cap and the lead time to manufacture parts, but why can't Red Bull simply pull out or remanufacture early season spec parts? At least Verstappen could drive that spec of the car. It seems ever since Horner survived the coup that Red Bull refuses to do the obvious, for example, chucking Checo Perez or reverting to an older spec of the car.
Yes, you could do that, but the big problem really there, Chris, is that the rest of the teams haven't stood still, so they've all moved forward. And at the end of the day, we talk about from the beginning of the season to the end of the season, teams will tell you they gain sort of 2 seconds. Well, sorry, but they don't. A second would be massive. So if Red Bull did put together their Bahrain spec car, which obviously was a pretty decent package, and go to Azerbaijan with it, they could very easily be a second off the pace, and that would look worse than the bit of development they've done. The bit of development they've done, they've gone wrong somewhere with it, and that's the big problem, and they've got to identify where it is, because as far as they were concerned, the bits going onto the car should be faster, but they're not. So you have to identify where you've gone wrong, because that leads you in a direction for the future. If you don't identify where you've gone wrong, you end up just making those mistakes again. You just compound the problem. One of the things I'd jump in here and say that I think is a bit strange, around the Miami time, and again I did an article on it, they altered some of the turning vanes on the rear brake duct, on the inner end of the rear brake duct. And from what I could see, they sort of reduced the workload from those turning vanes. And that's a dodgy area, because the thing about the turning vanes on the rear brake duct is that they produce load directly onto the rear tyre. It doesn't have to go through the suspension, so there's no time lag. And when you arrive at a corner, like braking and turning into a corner, that is such a critical amount of load that's produced directly onto that rear tyre. It's not as though like it's going through the suspension, because the suspension, because the load's coming down so much, the suspension's on the way up. So any load you're getting from the wing is being cancelled out by the sprung mass of the car going upwards. You're leaving the wheels behind you on the ground. So any load you can put directly onto the ground stays with you all the time. So there's areas where I would question their development direction, but I don't think it's right for them to go back just completely. I think they need to pursue finding out where they've gone wrong to help them with the future as far as going forward's concerned.
The next question comes from Gerald Sherlin, who says, do you think that the new FIA brake rule was the reason for Red Bull's drop in form relative to the other teams?
Well, it could very easily be. We don't know. We don't get enough information. It was obviously put in place for some reason. And earlier in this podcast, we talked about sort of the front wing deflection, and changing the regulations for it. And not changing the regulations for next year, whenever all of us know that the teams are questioning this front wing deflection. But there's some reason for the FIA clarifying that braking rule during the season. And it's just not to say that somebody wasn't doing it. I'm not by any means saying it was Red Bull, and I doubt very much if Red Bull were doing it. However, you have to sort of, 2 and 2 do make 4, but sometimes it does make 5 as well, if you add it correctly. So at the end of the day, you need to sort of think about it. Did it happen at the same time? If it did, the drivers need to know about it, because to use it correctly, you need to know that this is what you've got. And it's one of those sort of situations where I think that questions will obviously come up about it. Personally, as I say, I don't think that Red Bull would have gone to that extent to have used something like that. But again, who knows? It's a question sitting out there still waiting for a proper answer from somebody who might inside that might know.
Yeah, and certainly everything that we're hearing, not just publicly but privately, says it wasn't anything specific, that it came out of the 26 rules discussions. The other thing that makes me think it's not that is Red Bull's problems have gone back a reasonable way, and I think if it was simply they weren't doing something they were once allowed to do, why would they be taking parts on and off the car and being confused and trying to recreate this early season balance? Because they'd know that it's not possible to do that, and there's a reason for it. So it doesn't entirely hang together for me from that perspective.
No, it doesn't entirely tie together. I agree with you completely. It's one of those things where, you know, the brake steer is something that would help these cars quite considerably with the understeer at low speed, because that's what you do a lot of braking for, and or traction, you know, mid corner. So the two do go together. The two tie in. You would try to do it if it was legal to do it, but doing it correctly with the regulations the way they were would be quite difficult to do it well. You could have a stab at it, but as I say, it's just one of those sort of situations that we got to know about it when the technical directive came out. But there might have been a warning shot fired across the bows of some teams prior to that. So we don't know when somebody had to do away with it. And then the technical directive was just to clarify it and make sure that every team, whenever no team had it, then every team knew that you couldn't do it. So it's a bit of a fine line, because seeing the regulations the way they were, as I say, it's pretty difficult to do something with it. But I'm not saying by any means that Red Bull were doing it. If there was room and an opening and a grey area, then I'm sure Red Bull would be a team that would try to exploit it, because that's what they've done in the past for a lot of the time. But I don't think it's the reason. I think just the reason is that they've got themselves a little bit lost.
The next question comes from Paul Housley, who says, I'm just listening to the F1 Tech Show and a question sprang to mind. In the world of active aero from 2026, could a car following be given an extra wing angle in corners to get back some of the performance lost in dirty air, like an inverse DRS, but feels less artificial? Well,
yes, it's more about the balance than the actual downforce load figure. I mean, both are important. But the driver drives the balance of the car, and he can drive with a little bit less downforce, or he could drive a little bit more. Now, if you could get a rear wing and a front wing that would have the window of opportunity to, say, generate, and it could be up to 20% of downforce, more downforce, to generate 20% more downforce as you arrive into a corner behind another car, it would work quite well. It couldn't just be a light switch. It couldn't be, here we go, 20% more downforce, immediately. It would need to be sort of a dimmer switch where it would, the car would be measuring the downforce it's losing and then compensating for it with front wing and rear wing angle. I think I'm not a big believer in this active aero. I think that, to be honest, active suspension would solve a huge amount of problems, and in theory you could use it as active aero. You could, for example, lower the front of the car in low speed corners to give you more front end, and you could raise the front of the car at high speed corners to give you more stability. So with active suspension, you would get everything that active aero would give you, because active aero, again, you need the actuators to do it. You need to be able to read the situation to do something with it. So, as I say, active aero to me seems the wrong way to go. Whenever active suspension would cure so many of the problems, the bumps, the porpoising, the stiffness of the cars, everything could be cured with active suspension. But I think the FIA look at that as a step backwards. There's no, most road cars out there now have some sort of active suspension system. So at the end of the day, it's about deciding what Formula One should be. Should it be a fixed plane, a car that, you have a lot of air load and it's up to you to do the best thing you can in the wind tunnel? Or should it be down to the engineers in the back of the garage from clicking a few buttons on your active suspension map and making the car better or worse, depending upon what you want? I don't know what Formula One should be, but as I say, comparing active aero to active suspension, if I was making a choice, I would be going active suspension because it would cater for so much of the problems.
Do you remember when they made that attempt to have a little bit of adjustable aero to give you a bit more downforce in 2009 and 10? They had that very minor front wing adjustment. You could adjust it a couple of times a lap. I think it would sort of put it from one position to another, then back again. But it didn't do a great deal, did it?
No, I mean, that's the problem. It needs to be vast. You're talking 20% here, roughly, as a number that you need to add onto the car, and that's a lot of front wing. And again, the cars are optimised around a given front wing angle. I mean, most teams will have their typical research point as a midpoint, whatever. Let's say you look at all the circuits in the world that you race at, and you'll look at the lateral G, the highest point of the lateral G, and you might find that it's, the car's pulling 3.5 G or whatever, 4 G at 180, 200 kilometers an hour, whatever it be. So you'll have that load at that certain speed, and that given wing angle, and that you need to create that load. So you'll do most of your work around there, knowing that when you go to Monaco or the higher downforce circuits, you're going to go up the graph, and the lower downforce circuits, you're going to go down the graph. But you sort of do all your initial research around that midpoint of the season, so you get the best bang for your buck for most of the time of the year, and then the other two extremes. So it's to optimize then the car at that level, and then say I'm going to fire on 4, 5, 6, whatever degrees of front wing. You'll destroy the rest of the car as such. It's something you can't really do. That's why we see so many different sort of trim angles of the front wing flap and optimization of different downforce levels, just because you have time to do that in the wind tunnel. But to make the car work in that big window, it's really, really difficult.
The next question comes from Brent McLeod. In contrast to the RB19 and 20 with their triple DRS and shark inlets, there's been little talk about anything particularly different or special relating to the design of the McLaren that would explain its recent dominance over all of the other teams. It seems that largely most teams, including McLaren, have settled on similar designs, yet they seem to have found something that the others haven't. What's behind McLaren's recent form?
Well, I think it is one of the things that's behind the recent form is coming from being a reasonable midfield team to a front-running team. They did that by understanding what they had to do to get to there, and by doing it correctly. So, they learned a lot on the way, and to take that, step further all the time is a little bit easier. I think their update from Miami was, give them X sort of numbers, and their improvement on the track, as far as they're concerned, was actually a better improvement than they thought they should get from it. But they knew what the numbers were, they knew what it was all about, and then from there they've exploited that a bit further. Whereas most of the other developments that we see, again on Red Bull and again on Mercedes, there's a question mark thrown in there. If you look at Mercedes, they put a new front wing on at Monaco. George Russell ran it. Went away from this super trick inboard end that they had on the front wing. Then they both ran it from Imola onwards. Now, Mercedes themselves say, "Oh yeah, the front wing didn't do anything," but it's still running it. It was a major step in their competitive performance, or it was a step in their competitive performance. Both drivers said it just changed the car quite dramatically. They've got to a point of winning races this year, so that's why I'm saying it's about taking what you've done, better or worse, and trying to analyse why. And then if it's better, you try and keep following that direction. And if it's worse, you say, well, that's not the way to go. Now, look, if we do this, it's in the opposite direction. Let's give that a shot. I don't think Mercedes, well, if we believe what Mercedes say, I don't think they actually, they talk about the front wing not being of benefit to the car. I think that's wrong. I think that did. And I don't know whether they took analysis of the improvement on the car as far as how the aerodynamic characteristics changed and then exploited that a bit further. But that's what I think McLaren have done. They've just taken the improvement on the car. It was an improvement. Hang on a minute or two. What did that really do? And let's just exploit it a little bit further each time. And, take it in tiny steps, because it's very easy, as Red Bull have proven, to lose yourself. So just making sure you really understand why, or why not. Either of the two, it doesn't really matter. But why is a good way to go, because you want to go forward as opposed to going backwards.
And it has shown, particularly under these rules, this is always important, but having a consistent car with a wide operating window is just critical with these regs, isn't it? More so than on the old ones, because obviously it's relatively easy to pile downforce on and get very unusable downforce in this, whereas I remember James Allison saying with the old regs, you could kind of keep piling downforce on, and as long as it was sensibly done, generally it would keep making the cars go faster, but there seem to be a lot more limitations to hit. So a car that seems to be sort of nicely in the middle, like the McLaren, is maybe your optimal performer, because it always, same at Monza. I was watching trackside in the first session, and the McLaren just straight away looked like just one of the most sensible, predictable car, a car that was just doing what it should be, and that is very beneficial.
Yeah, I mean, I've done a lot of vocal stuff on downforce. It's so easy to find downforce, but you have to get driver-friendly downforce. Now, if you take the old car regulations, let's say, the underfloor of the flat bottom before 2022 produced probably something like 30% of the downforce, of the total downforce, and the upper body produced like 70% of the total downforce. So that's reversed completely with these ground effect cars, and that's the problem. Ground effect's always been a problem because it's in the name, ground effect. You're getting the effect of the downforce from the ground. You're moving across the ground, the track surface. The difference in the track surface abrasion level can be different for the downforce. We talk about separation. It's just because the car's changing so much to that critical thing, which is the ground, and I can understand James Allison's statement about the old cars. You could just keep piling on downforce because it was all away from the ground as such. It wasn't, it wasn't using the ground as the other part of that downforce. It was aerodynamic components and turning vanes and bits and pieces that would affect the airflow around the car. Whereas this is pure grunt from underneath the car. And, back in the 80s when we had ground effect, and I was involved with it then, late 70s, 80s. I mean, it's still the same problems, exactly. We had sliding skirts at the time. Now, that was a nightmare. That was just an absolute nightmare. We had these sliding skirts that just, one stuck up and you were finished. That was it, you're off the road because you lost a ton of downforce. And that's just the same now as the car being close to the ground or being far away. That was the same as a skirt. The skirt was either on the ground, sealed, or it was off the ground. And the difference was night and day. And, with this ground effect cars we had then, the centre of pressure of the underfloor was so far forward, the cars were running without any front wing. So when the front of the car, the underfloor, gave up, you had nothing. So they were really, really hard days with so much less technology to understand it than you have currently. So I think, although we see a lot of complaining, these guys have not lived through the period of time that was just an absolute nightmare. A couple of people have, and Adrian Newey's one of them. He's nearly the same age as me, I suppose. But he's seen a bit of that as well through his time with Indy cars and Formula One. So, experience is everything when it comes to this sort of stuff. And it's easy to sort of talk about it, and it's very, very hard to do it. But still, you got to think laterally with a ground effect car.
Yeah, and certainly McLaren seem to have done that. The final question comes from Kev Duckworth. At the start of the season, Mercedes had the two options for anti-dive, geometry, standard and the extreme one. Since then, we, or at least I, have heard nothing of which one they're using. Did they settle on one of them? Are they changing between circuits, maybe on how bumpy the braking zones are, or has this not been something people have been watching? I, for one, was keen to see how this went during the year, especially as it was rumoured the chassis weight penalty for facilitating this was significant.
Well, Again, the we part of that's quite good because I don't know either. I would imagine, to be honest, that they would have settled down on one position. I had a look at a few pictures after I saw the question, tried to find out if it still had the adjustable part on the side of the monocoque, and I couldn't find any as of late. To be honest, with the situation with Mercedes, I would think they would hone in on one and leave it there because you can have too many variables. You've got all the setup stuff that you can do, but it's very easy to sort of have too much. And, obviously if you change the dive on the front suspension, anti-dive on the front suspension, you end up, you can alter spring rates around that. You can alter so much stuff around that, damping, etc. And where do you draw the line and where do you say, enough's enough? I don't want any more variables. So I don't know is the answer of whether they still do two or whether they've honed in on one and left it alone there. I would imagine that at the beginning they were doubtful of the amount of anti-dive they were putting on the car, that it would be they'd be able to live with it. So I think the initial test would be try one, try the other, and then just go to one. I don't know whether that's the maximum or the minimum, but I'll try and find out if we can. Between Edd and myself, we'll have a bit of skullduggery and get you an answer.
Yeah, what we do know is when they ran it in testing in the more extreme configuration, it was problematic, and they reverted to how it was originally, and they carried on. And certainly Monza, looking at the position, it is kind of what you might call the primary position, the less aggressive one, and the more aggressive anti-dive geometry was pretty extreme. So yeah, that's definitely the case. We will check a bit more on it. I suspect they haven't gone there again, but I couldn't swear to that. So we'll ask a few questions.
I would agree with that assumption. It's the end of the day, it's the same old thing. They didn't have a lot to begin with, and then they went to, you look at it and you say, well, if that's making such a big difference, this is roughly the amount that Red Bull have, so we'll give ourselves another bet, just in case that, Red Bull didn't go as far. It is very difficult because obviously the more anti-dive you have on the front of the car, the less feeling the driver has through the brake pedal. And through his senses and such, but mainly the brake pedal. So, there is a happy medium there where you can have enough to support the car, but give the driver a little bit of feel, or you have too much and basically you start locking wheels all the time.
Well, thanks to everyone for your questions. A good set there as always. Like I said, if you've got a question you'd like to ask, send it to podcasts@therace.com. That's podcasts@the-race.com, and Gary will be delighted to pile in on answering them. It's always a favourite part of the podcast for everyone. Thanks very much, Gary, as always, for your input. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, so that will probably be amid the Baku-Singapore doubleheader, because the Formula One season keeps coming thick and fast. So join us then for more from Gary.
The Athletic.